are really failing to understand that, and it's very frustrating because the precedent of this legislation is just very, very, scary.
Our guest is Laila Abdelaziz. She's Legislative and Government Affairs Director at CAIR Florida. You're listening to MidPoint. My name is Seán. I'm the host of MidPoint Monday. It's 12:26 in the afternoon on 88.5 FM and WMNF.org. We're talking about a bill in Tallahassee that would punish groups that organize boycotts of or divestment from Israel. So would those churches that you mentioned, if they do business in Florida, would they be on this no contracts list if this bill passes?
I think that what concerns me with how this legislation defines company is it does include in its definition of company organizations, but the whole point is any entity that makes profit. So for example, at the University of South Florida, there has been this ongoing movement to get the university to divest from companies that are directly involved in these alleged human rights violations. And this follows in the heat of Hampshire College, which was the first university in the United States to divest from Israeli occupation. And since then, many universities, many student groups across the country have been asking their foundations and their endowment funds to divest from Israeli occupation as well. There's this ongoing movement at the university to do so, and the foundation, the USF Foundation, is tasked with making profit on behalf of the university. So hypothetically, if this student group were to successfully pass a divestment resolution at the University of South Florida, and the Board of Trustees were to finally make that decision, would the foundation then be blacklisted under this bill? I mean, we don't know. We don't know with certainty. Bill sponsors have failed to answer that question themselves. And I think that just, if you listen to the rhetoric and to the defense of the co-sponsors as to why they're creating this bill, they say it very clearly that they want the state to boycott people who boycott something they don't agree with. So hypothetically, the state is boycotting people, not hypothetically, but literally the state is boycotting people because of federally protected political speech, and that's very dangerous.
So do you think that if this passes that there will be a legal challenge?
We definitely anticipate that there will be a legal challenge. The legislature passed a similar amendment targeting Cuba in 2012, and a company immediately challenged that amendment, and it was held successful. A federal court struck down the Cuba amendment that is currently in our state statutes. And the state legislature has failed to update our state statutes to reflect that federal court decision. So we definitely think there's a precedent there to challenge this law if it passes.
So let me see if I have that straight. The Cuba bill was similar to the bill that's being in Tallahassee now about BDS against Israel.
So in 2012, the legislature passed a similar measure that would blacklist companies in the state of Florida that did business with Cuba. And immediately a company challenged that, and they were successful in their federal court case.
So a court said that law is unconstitutional.
Yes.
And
yes.
So it would be pretty easy to guess that the same thing might happen if this happens. The legislature can go through all this effort, pass this bill, and then they'll go to court, they'll spend all that money, and then it's very likely or possible that it will be declared unconstitutional.
We definitely hope so, because as it currently stands, many states throughout the country have something called the scrutinized companies list. The State Department has identified state sponsors of terrorism that the country and states and businesses within the United States are prohibited from doing business with. On the State Department's state sponsors of terrorism list, there are only 3 countries: Iran, Sudan, and Syria. Palestinian civil society and this grassroots movement is not on that State Department's state sponsors of terrorism list. So this attempt, even though it just aims to expand our state's scrutinized companies list, does not mirror federal law or federal policy. And federal policy actually, goes against the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Ban Ki-moon has reiterated in an op-ed just yesterday posted in the New York Times that the settlements in the West Bank are illegal under international law, and they do go against our U.S. policies. So if Americans, if businesses, if organizations and entities in the United States want to uphold human rights and do their share in pressuring Israel and Israeli companies and companies that are also complicit in the occupation to withdraw from Israeli settlements, the state is stigmatizing that speech. And that's very frustrating.
Let's go back and talk about this USF movement here.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a group at USF, and when you say that, you might think of a small group, but they collected 10,000 signatures to support
Which
this.
was the largest petition in Florida university history.
10,000 petitions from USF students of a student body of around 40,000, let's say, that said that they think that their school should, the foundation should divest from companies that profit from human rights violators in Palestine, something to that effect, right? And a couple of years ago, a small group of Students for Justice in Palestine went to the trustees for the foundation. They didn't get to meet with the whole group, but they gave a presentation to representatives from that group, and it was immediately rejected, very quickly was rejected. And then recently, this came back up as a student government proposition.
Resolution. Some
senators brought it into the student senate, and it just passed 32 to 12. There were 5 abstentions, 32 to 12. So pretty overwhelmingly it passed. And according to the Oracle, at least, the 12 people that said no, one of the reasons that they gave was this Florida law. They said, look, if we vote for this, we might get in trouble if this Florida law passes.
So that's, I think, the entire point of this legislation is to stigmatize people that are organizing for the human rights of Palestinians. And what we're seeing, I think the greatest threat to pro-Israel groups in the United States and throughout the country and the world is the BDS movement, because it's a non-violent movement that people can just on their own put pressure on Israel, put pressure on companies. And although you'll hear different rhetoric, you'll hear people say that BDS doesn't mean anything and BDS is having no impact on the Israeli economy, but at the same time you have the Israeli Knesset trying to also make it illegal for companies and individuals in Israel to themselves participate in BDS. I mean, there's an active movement even within Israel to participate and uphold the BDS call of the Palestinian Civil Society for Human Rights. And I think that the point of this legislation, even though I want to reiterate that were this bill to pass, an individual in the state of Florida can absolutely still boycott products of Israeli companies. I mean, this legislation does not impact an individual and the individual's rights to boycott products from Israeli settlements or however they choose to apply BDS in their own lives. But it does stigmatize organizations and groups, and it does put pressure on students that probably don't understand how laws work, how the state legislature works, how these things affect their own universities. But there is a fear that hypothetically, were this bill to pass, it would affect the USF Foundation, were the USF Foundation to ever divest from companies that are participating in the Israeli occupation.
And I asked the USF, what's the likelihood of that? And they gave me the same answer they gave me when I was asking about the 10,000 signatures a couple of years ago. And they said, essentially, the USF Foundation said they're not going to listen to these students, and they're not going to listen to anyone. If anyone came to them and said, you should be investing or not investing in this or that, no, we're not going to listen to it at all, is essentially what they said. So this bill, it was passed by the student government senate, and now it may go to, it may be.
Well, it was vetoed by the student body president.
Okay.
So I think that's the latest news on the resolution, which there's a lot of pressures going on. I think there's kind of this battleground movement happening at the University of South Florida now. We've heard very concerning things from organizers and students that are trying to uphold the student call for ethical investment. And what the students found at USF through their process of campaigning for divestment from the Israeli occupation is that the University of South Florida's foundation does not have an ethical guidelines committee, which is something that many universities have. So although University of South Florida just declared itself a tobacco-free campus, for example, they're heavily invested in the tobacco industry. They're heavily invested in G4S, the private prison system. University President Judy Genschaft herself has been found to be invested in these businesses and investment companies that are directly complicit in the Israeli occupation. So there's a lot of shadowy special interest there, and there's a lot of pressure being put on these students that are just simply asking for ethical investments on behalf of their student public dollars, and the Board of Trustees and the university are just turning a blind eye to that call.
Yeah, it seems that you would think that in the future something might change there, because regardless of where you end up on any one particular issue, and especially an issue as contentious as Israel and Palestine, for the foundation, the USF Foundation, to say we're not going to take anyone's advice, we're not going to listen to anyone. I mean, I think that the point you made about the tobacco it makes a lot of sense. I'm sure, it seems like in a logical world, there could be a way for groups to organize and say, look, we have this tobacco-free campus, maybe there should be some flexibility there, and maybe we should think about not investing in it. But as of right now, that's at least what they told me, is that they are not going to listen to anyone about anything, not make any kind of investment judgments based on what anyone asks them to do.
Yeah, I think that they're just kind of approaching this from a very narrow, we're here to make money and we're here to make profit on behalf of the university, and regardless of human rights or regardless of seemingly hypocritical policies, we are going to do as we please to make money on behalf of the university. But I think that, just with the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement that applied to South African apartheid has parallels here. For decades, that movement was pushed back against. For decades, that movement was, there was legislation also to target and inhibit people that were asking for BDS targeting South African apartheid. But a people under occupation and a people seeking their own human rights, I think that there's nothing that can be done to quell that kind of political movement. And I think that our legislators and the University of South Florida seem to be on the wrong side of history here.
Moving away from USF for the time being at least, and back to Tallahassee, when you went up there to testify against this bill, what was the response of that committee or individuals you talked to one-on-one, or the committee as a whole when you were giving them your comments?
Well, you have to understand the reality of politics in the state legislature. The Senate sponsor of this legislation is Senate President Joe Negron. And in such a politically divisive climate in our state legislature, do you want to be that person that goes against the Senate President? I mean, that's a clear signal. And Senator Negron is going to the media himself saying that this bill is his third priority. So after he says that water issues, university issues, and then this issue is his third priority this legislative session. So legislators, their hands are kind of tied, because if they want their bills, they're trying to serve the direct needs of their constituents in their communities. And they go against the Senate President, they're putting themselves in a very, very difficult position. And I understand that. We recognize that. But there's also no grassroots movement in Florida asking for this kind of legislation to be passed. There's actually the opposite. There's a grassroots movement throughout the state of Florida organizing for universities, for example, to divest from the Israeli occupation. So it's directly conflicting with, if anything, whatever Floridians are saying on this topic. And at the same time, the legislation has overwhelming bipartisan support. Every single member of the leadership of the minority party is also a co-sponsor of the legislation in the Senate side. I mean, you're seeing, our state is dealing with fracking issues, is dealing with healthcare issues, is dealing with transportation issues, with water issues. Our governor had sent a message to his staff that they couldn't use the words climate change. And at the same time, this legislation, which is attacking Floridians' First Amendment rights, is receiving bipartisan support overwhelmingly. No one is even challenging it in committee, and that's very frustrating.
So were there any no votes in that committee?
No, there was one no vote in the Senate. That was State Senator Dwight Bullard in the committee stop that it had gone to. And I think that if you kind of watch how the votes happen, Senator Bullard voted against the legislation when it was in his committee and voted for the bill on the Senate floor. And that just kind of proves the kind of influence that is behind this legislation.
Well, I want to go to the phones. Let me give out the number again. My guest is Laila Abdelaziz. She's the Legislative and Government Affairs Director at CAIR Florida. She's also a board member here at WMNF, I should say that. And the number here is 813-239-9663, and you can email us at dj@wmnf.org. Text us at 813-433-0885. This is MidPoint Monday on WMNF Tampa. I'm Seán Kinane, and it's 12:41 in the afternoon. Zebulon, you're on the air. What would you like to say?
America here in Florida with our congressional districts. Majority of Floridians are Democrats and lean more progressive. But we have this sort of, stacked deck in our legislature with these panhandle Republicans basically calling all the legislative shots. So if you're going to solve anything long-term in Florida, you have to get rid of the gerrymandering. But getting down to the specific issue, they probably are looking at this as turnabout as fair play. Okay, you're going to boycott, we'll boycott you. Well, Florida itself can be boycotted by these same organizations if this legislation passes. In other words, let's say you're a company that loses its state contract with Florida over this issue because you refuse to, invest in companies that profit from Israeli occupation of Palestine. Well, you can always boycott Florida when it comes time for investment in pension funds, for instance, for your employees. You wouldn't invest in any businesses that are in Florida. You can also say, okay, every time we have a convention, Florida's off the list. You don't come here anymore. And, Florida depends on a lot of conventions and tourism for its income. So, there are avenues to fight back even if this thing gets passed. But I wanted to put a question to your guest because, first of all, I just want to say I'm completely in sympathy with the aims and the overall strategy of BDS. Because as you made, the connection, I was going to make it, I'm glad you already made it, with the South African BDS movement and how effective it eventually was. This can be very effective. What I wanted to ask you is, how do you address some of the things that have been pointed out by people like Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, that overall the BDS movement's a great idea, but that sometimes in the particulars they actually end up hurting some of the Palestinians in the occupied territories by shutting down Israeli businesses that provide much-needed employment at pretty decent pay levels in the occupied territories, and then that forces these people, if they can't get comparable work in the occupied territories, to go through horrendous checkpoints twice a day to get in.
Good question, Zebulon.
That's definitely a very good question. And for listeners that don't know, I'm actually Palestinian. I was born in Palestine. So a quick story, I was visiting my family in 2014, and, as someone that also applies BDS in my day-to-day life, however I can, as an individual, stay away from products or companies or businesses that are directly complicit in the Israeli occupation, I do choose to do so. So in my family's home, I opened the fridge, and it was an Israeli company gallon of milk. And I kind of look at my aunt, and I'm like, what are you doing here? Like, haven't you heard your own Palestinian civil society's call for boycott? And the reality is Palestinians in the West Bank can't buy other products. Palestinians as a people can't trade and can't open their borders to get goods and services from other regions of the world. And so they're forced to buy Israeli products. They're forced to work in Israeli factories because of the shortages and the mobility restrictions in the West Bank. I think it's, Palestinians suffer in immeasurable ways. Palestinians that live in Israel and Palestinians that live in Gaza and the West Bank. And although it's a very it's a valid critique to say, for example, shutting down the SodaStream factory in the occupied West Bank will force Palestinians to lose jobs. But I think that the reality is it's time for no more Band-Aid solutions, no more short-term policies that actually propagate and further erode the possibility of a solution. And it's time to force the international community and Israel and the United States to have a serious conversation about what does a solution, a peaceful solution to this decades-long military occupation look like. And Palestinian academics and Palestinian youth are frustrated. They see no other options, no other opportunities. Unemployment in Gaza and the West Bank is overwhelmingly high. It is a very depressing state, and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza rely on their families in the diaspora. So rely on their families in the United States, in Australia, in Latin America, to economically subsidize them so that they can survive off of their land and survive in the very difficult conditions that they're forced to live with in the West Bank. It's a short-term loss, but I think for a long-term solution to the conflict.
And it kind of points out the dependence that Palestinians have on the state of Israel, whereas in a future time when there's a Palestinian state, whether it's the two states or one state, whatever it is, that there'll be more of an independence, I think is what people are hoping the future would be like for Palestinians.
Absolutely. And even under the Oslo Accords, for example, Palestinians, and if you go to the West Bank, you have Bethlehem, you have Jerusalem, you have Jericho. I mean, just fascinating historical sites. But Palestinians are prohibited from creating a tourism economy. So they're so reliant on the measures and the long-reaching arms of the occupation that it just keeps paralyzing and derailing any hope for Palestinians to create a stable civil society, a stable economy. And it's time to address these issues head on, and And it's complicated. I think BDS is a grassroots movement, so you can apply it to yourself as an individual in the ways that you think make sense. So if you don't think that it makes sense to put pressure on factories that are in the West Bank that are providing jobs to Palestinians, then that's your right to make. But you can stay away from buying those products.
And what about, to Zebulon's point, that has to do more with Florida politics than anything happening per se in the Middle East, and that's that gerrymandering has created a legislative system where it's not very representative of the thoughts and opinions of Floridians in general. How will redistricting moderate that? Do you think that
the state legislature is disproportionately unrepresentative of the Floridian population? You definitely do have more registered Democrats in the state than you do Republicans. You have a very diverse and well-established minority community throughout the state, and the state legislature does not reflect that at all. I'm there every week during legislative session, and what we're seeing now is kind of the courts repairing this gerrymandering problem. We have new state Senate maps, we're waiting for new congressional maps, so we hope that this will kind of be the turning point in allowing Floridians to elect people that are more representative of their communities. But it also takes people just need to get involved. I think Floridians are frustrated, and their trust in the system is being eroded every single time the last legislative session, the state legislature has one job, and that's to pass a budget. They weren't able to do that. They had to call a special session, which is wasting taxpayer dollars to get them to do the one thing that they're supposed to be doing. I think Floridians should be watching and paying attention. I think they should be very frustrated. It's an election cycle. Find out who's being challenged, find out who the candidates are, develop relationships with them, and make sure that you elect public officials that are elected to serve the public, not special interests that can elect people very easily.
And you said the courts were doing a correction, but it was brought about by people power. It was the ballot initiatives that people put on the ballot that said fair districts.
Fair districts and the lawsuits, right? The League of Women voters lawsuits, and there were others that were part of that lawsuit as well. So we definitely hope that with the redistricting maps that we will start moving towards a more reflective state legislature.
All right, let's see what Don in Venice has to say. Hi, Don.
Hi, Don. Good. How are you?
Thank you for that question, Don. So, Laila, what did we learn after World War II about the legality of confiscating territories during war?
That it's illegal.
Yeah.
And there's definitely the 1967 white borders. If you look at the amount of property and land that Israel has besieged from Palestinian territories according to those lines, it's irrefutable. I mean, you can't deny that there's a massive land loss happening to the Palestinian people. I think that we are a globe and country that is governed by laws, by man-made laws, and every individual is free to believe whatever they may. But at the same time, you have to think that, if your faith system is telling you to bless Israel, that's totally fair and you're free to think so. But is it a blessing to be complicit in human rights violations? I don't think that anyone would agree that that's a blessing. And just as I said earlier on the show, you don't let your friend drive drunk, right? You have to step in and you have to get involved and prevent bad things from happening. And you can't avoid the fact that settlements are illegal under international law. They're against the U.S. policy. They're expanding. Netanyahu's administration keeps greenlighting more and more settlements in Palestinian territory. The people of Gaza are living under very inhumane conditions, limited medical care, limited access to trade and getting resources from outside of the blockaded Gaza Strip, limited mobility in the West Bank. I mean, you have Palestinians that live in their own territory, but they have access to 10% of their roadways. And all of these measures and policies are put into place to further occupy and kind of strangle the Palestinian people from communicating with one another, from creating civil society to develop an actual political resistance to the military occupation. And that's what the BDS movement is targeting. The BDS movement is asking for equal rights under the law, and you can't challenge that.
The discourse in this country is kind of narrow when it comes to Israel and Palestine, and maybe the votes in Tallahassee kind of mirror that. But I read a lot of Israeli media, and the discourse there is a pretty wide open one and pretty open, and there's a lot of diversity of opinions within Israeli society. And I think people who are listening who hear that you're a Palestinian and that you work for CAIR, they might think, yeah, of course, you have the Palestinians' best interest in mind, and maybe you think that that the things you're describing are best for Palestinians, and so that means that they're not good for Israel. But I read a lot of op-eds in Haaretz, for example, of Israelis, Zionists, Jewish Israelis, who say that the occupation of the West Bank, the occupation of Gaza, is very harmful to the continuation of the state of Israel. When you said you visited recently, what did you hear from people in Israel?
Well, as an American and a Palestinian that travels to Israel-Palestine, I know firsthand that the Israeli press and the Israeli media is allowed to be more honest about the realities of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people than the U.S. media is. It is not true that being critical of Israel and being critical of Israeli policies equals anti-Semitism. I mean, it's just absolutely not true at all. I think that if anything, Palestinians in the global world, and here in America, a lot of people will say, well, why do you hold on to this issue? Why are you so focused on Israel-Palestine? We know that the United States, time and time again, protects Israel and the status quo in Israel-Palestine.